They didn't save me a seat near the front, and they didn't save me a spot on the program either. When I stepped into the hall that afternoon, the first thing I noticed was the flowers, big arrangements of white roses and pale green stems lining the aisle. They were beautiful, cold, but beautiful. Then I saw Patrick, my son, my only child. He stood near the front, laughing at something someone whispered in his ear. When he turned and saw me, his face didn't change. No smile, no surprise, just a nod, like I was someone's coworker or a neighbor's friend who showed up without RSVPing. I had spent the morning pressing my navy dress, the one George always liked, said it made me look steady. I'd picked it because I wanted to feel like myself today. Not flashy, not forgotten, just his mother. There was no usher waiting for me. Elise's stepmother spotted me by the door and gave me a little wave, the kind that says, "Hi there, but don't come too close." She pointed me toward the middle row, not the family section, just somewhere in the back. I sat down with my purse on my lap, both hands folded tight, like I was back in church. The room filled up quickly. Elise's family sat in neat rows, laughing softly. Everyone looked like they belonged. I scanned the program. Page 1 had the couple's names in a shiny silver font. Page 2 listed the wedding party. Elise's parents, her brothers, her 2 best friends from college. On the last page, they thanked everyone for coming. Elise even thanked the florist by name. But not me. I kept telling myself it was just an oversight, that maybe Patrick would say something during the reception. Maybe he'd grab the mic and thank me for raising him, for loving him. But I knew better. When Patrick turned 13, he started pulling away. That's normal, I told myself. But when George got sick, the space between us got wider. I thought after the funeral, we'd pull closer again. But we didn't. He called less, visited even less than that. By the time he met Elise, I was already standing outside the circle. I brought a note with me that day. I had written it the night before. Just a few words. Nothing fancy. I wanted to speak during the rehearsal dinner, say something about Patrick's father, about how proud George would have been. But there was no rehearsal dinner speech slot for me. The mic passed from Elise's dad, to her college roommate, to Patrick's best friend from law school. Not once did anyone look my way. I folded the note back into my purse. When the music started, everyone stood. Elise walked in wearing lace and satin, her hair in soft curls. She looked beautiful. She really did. And Patrick, standing at the end of the aisle, looked proud. I watched as they exchanged vows, slid rings onto each other's fingers. I smiled, because that's what you do. But I felt like a stranger sitting in someone else's story. During the cocktail hour, I wandered over to the table with framed pictures. One of those growing up displays. Photos of Patrick as a baby, Patrick at camp, Patrick in high school football gear. I looked at each one carefully. I wasn't in a single photo, not even the one from his high school graduation, though I remembered standing just behind the photographer, holding his diploma in my hands when he handed it to me after the picture. The final picture was of him and Elise on a mountain trail, a photo I'd never seen before, printed in black and white, framed in gold. I stood there too long enough for a waiter to ask if I needed anything. I shook my head and walked outside for air. The sky had gone soft gray, the kind that says rain's on the way. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and leaned on the railing. I had never felt so out of place in my own son's life. Not when he left for college. Not when he missed Christmas the year Elise's parents invited them to Aspen. Not even when he forgot my birthday 2 years ago and sent a text the next morning. This was different. This was being erased quietly. Later that evening, I found a quiet corner near the back where I could sip ginger ale and watch the dancing. Patrick spun, Elise across the floor, while the guests clapped and took videos. Her father gave a toast full of warmth and stories. And me, I just sat there. At one point, a young girl handed me a plate of cake. She didn't say anything, just placed it on the table and walked away. I didn't eat it. I waited until most of the guests had left, then gathered my purse and walked out. No one said goodbye. Not Patrick, not Elise, just the valet who brought my car around and said, "Hope you had a good time, ma'am." I nodded. On the drive home, I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just stared out at the headlights ahead of me and kept thinking they didn't even save me a seat. And that was when I first realized something had shifted, not just in Patrick, but in me. Have you ever felt invisible at your own child's celebration? If this part of the story stirred something in you, take a moment to hit the like button or share your experience in the comments. And also subscribe. You're not alone. Your voice matters here. 3 days after the wedding, Patrick sent me a message. It was short. Just, "Hey mom, want to grab brunch this weekend? Elise and I would love to catch up." No call. No, thank you for coming. Not even a line about how nice it was to see me. Still, I said yes. We met at a place near downtown Asheville, one of those spots with mismatched chairs and string lights hung from the ceiling. Patrick was already there when I walked in. Elise sat across from him, scrolling on her phone. She didn't look up until the hostess brought me over. Elise smiled like we were meeting for the first time. "Sophia, you look lovely." I nodded, took my seat, and folded the napkin across my lap. The waiter came by. Patrick ordered avocado toast and black coffee. Elise got something with goat cheese and arugula. I asked for pancakes. Small talk came first. They told me about their honeymoon in Costa Rica. Elise showed me pictures on her phone, mountains, cocktails, a sloth hanging from a tree. I smiled where it felt polite to. They talked about a spa they went to that used hot stones and flower petals. Patrick said it made him think about energy and how space affects mood. I stirred my coffee and waited. Then Elise leaned in. "We've been talking a lot about the future," she said, "and we had this idea." Patrick chimed in. "You remember the property out in Waynesville? Dad's side of the family used to live there." I nodded once. "That house has real potential," he said. "We drove by it a few months ago. Still has the original wood siding, the porch columns, the orchard in the back." Elise took over again. "We're thinking of starting something there. A boutique venue. Not just weddings, retreats, private dinners, workshops. The area's booming with people looking for that rustic chic vibe." I didn't say anything. Patrick smiled like he was explaining something exciting to a friend. "We'd do the renovations, manage the bookings, everything. It would be your name on paper, of course, easier for zoning and taxes that way." Elise reached into her tote bag and pulled out a glossy pamphlet. We put together a mock-up, just some early ideas. She laid it on the table in front of me. The front page said the Hawthorne House, where past meets possibility. I didn't touch it. "We just want you to consider it," she said, voice soft like she was asking me to pass the salt. "It'd be temporary. Technically, you'd still own it. Just a way to activate the space, make it useful." Patrick nodded along. "It'd be smart, legacy-minded. We're not trying to take anything from you, Mom. Just include you in the next chapter." Include. That word landed heavier than they realized. I looked down at my plate. The pancakes were getting cold. I thought about the last time I'd been to that house. Before George got sick. We spent summers there, picking blackberries from the edge of the woods and sitting on the porch when the rain rolled in. That place wasn't just land to me. It was a piece of a life I'd built with my hands. They weren't talking about memories. They were talking about lighting fixtures and guest capacity. Patrick kept going. We'd handle the contractors, the marketing, all of it. You wouldn't have to lift a finger. I finally spoke. I see. They both nodded like I'd agreed to something. Elise reached for her water. We just thought, why let it sit unused? It's such a waste of potential. A waste? I took a breath. I'll think about it. That was all I said. Patrick grinned. That's all we're asking. After brunch, we walked to the parking lot. They hugged me goodbye. Elise said, "We're really excited about this." I watched them drive off in their new SUV, the one with the wedding gift bow still hanging off the antenna. I sat in my car for a few minutes before starting it. The air felt thick, like summer had overstayed its welcome. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry either. What I felt was something smaller, quieter, like being passed over in a conversation you started. I drove home with the pamphlet still sitting in my purse. I didn't open it. I already knew what it said, and what it didn't. Not once did either of them ask what that place meant to me. Not once did they ask if I'd ever planned to live there again. To them, it was square footage, a charming name, a location. To me, it was where George and I had danced barefoot in the kitchen, where Patrick learned to ride his bike on the gravel path, where my mother-in-law taught me how to bake bread from scratch. I pulled into my driveway, just as the sun started dipping behind the trees. I sat in the car for a moment longer. Then I whispered, to no one in particular, "They don't know what they're asking for." And I meant it. The attic hadn't been opened in a long time. I had to pull the step stool out from the laundry room, wipe the dust off the top, and hold the rail a little tighter than I used to. The house creaked above me as I pushed the panel open. The attic smelled like time. Old paper, dry wood, a little mildew, the kind of scent that brings back things you didn't know you were holding on to. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Maybe some kind of grounding. Maybe just something that felt like mine. In the far corner, past the stack of Christmas boxes and George's old fishing gear, was the cedar chest. I hadn't opened it since a few months after the funeral. The latch stuck a little, but it finally gave. Inside were folded quilts, an old pair of George's boots, a stack of photo albums wrapped in twine. I moved the top layers gently. At the very bottom was a thick brown envelope. My name was written on it, just Sophia. Nothing else. The handwriting was unmistakable, block letters, clean and slow, like he always wrote when he wanted to be sure I'd understand every word. The postmark was from 2 months before he passed. I sat down right there on the attic floor and opened it. Inside was a letter, 3 pages, written front and back. The first line read, "If you're reading this, I'm already gone." He always was direct. He wrote about the estate, the one in Waynesville, said he had officially transferred ownership into my name the year before, without telling anyone. He said he wanted to avoid confusion later. He mentioned Patrick by name, said he'd started noticing how Patrick looked at the property differently, not like a place with roots, but like a business opportunity. George wrote, "I'm not blaming him, Sophia. The world raised him to think like that, but I don't want you bullied or guilt into giving away something that was meant for you." He reminded me the house originally belonged to my great-grandparents, that I'd spent every summer of my childhood there, that it was the first place we went after we got married. That's where we celebrated Patrick's first birthday, right there on the back porch, under the oak tree. George had attached a copy of the deed. My name sat clearly at the top. No joint signatures, no asterisks, no fine print. There was also a notarized statement from his lawyer confirming the transfer, dated, signed, and filed. I turned the letter over, just to be sure I hadn't missed anything. The last paragraph was short. You don't owe that house to anyone. You don't owe yourself to anyone either. I sat for a long time, without moving. The insulation scratched at my legs, and a little light came through the attic window, hitting the dust in the air. I could almost hear George's voice. Not loud, just calm, like it always was when he was trying to keep me from doubting myself. I ran my hand along the edge of the chest and thought about what Elise had said, that the house had potential, that it was a waste to let it sit. But to me, that house wasn't a project. It was a memory that had somehow held its shape. That hallway still carried the scent of soap and warm pine. The closet in the back bedroom still held the wool blanket George's mother had crocheted. The cracked tile in the kitchen was still there, right where Patrick dropped a glass bottle of milk when he was 7. It wasn't perfect, but it was whole, and no one had ever asked me what I wanted to do with it. Not Patrick, not Elise. They saw it as square footage, as equity, but George saw it as mine. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope, then back into the chest. I kept the deed with me. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, but I knew I needed it close. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and stared at the folder. It didn't feel like power. It felt like clarity, the kind that settles in slowly, the way morning sun creeps across the floor. The next morning, I called Lorna. We hadn't spoken much since George passed. She used to be an estate attorney, but now she ran a used bookstore and only handled a few things here and there. She answered on the second ring. I asked if we could meet. Of course, she said. Come by the shop tomorrow morning. I'll unlock the back room. I hung up the phone and looked back at the letter again. George always had a way of seeing ahead. He didn't always say much, but he noticed everything. He saw what was coming before I did. He saw how easily I might get pressured, how my silence might be mistaken for consent. And he gave me something I hadn't realized I needed. A clear, unshakable no, not out of anger, but out of love. That house wasn't just some old property. It was a reminder of who I had been, what I had built, and that I still had a choice in how my story went. This moment reminded Sophia that love sometimes looks like quiet protection. If you've ever had someone look out for you in ways you didn't realize until later, let us know in the comments. And if this part hit home, tap subscribe. There's more where this came from. The next morning, I drove downtown to Lorna's bookstore. She'd always loved books more than people. Even when we were younger, she carried paperbacks in her purse instead of makeup. After retiring from estate law, she opened that little shop on Church Street with her own money and never looked back. The sign out front read, Second Editions. Her window display had a stack of cookbooks and a dusty globe. Inside smelled like cedar shelves and old pages. Lorna was in the back, wearing her usual sweater and scarf, even though it was barely cold out. She looked up when I walked in and didn't say anything right away. She just tilted her head slightly and gave me a knowing look. Follow me, she said, grabbing her mug and walking toward the back office. The door creaked as she opened it. There were boxes of old receipts stacked near the wall and a filing cabinet that looked older than both of us. A photo of her late husband sat beside a legal pad on the desk. She closed the door, sat down, and motioned for me to do the same. So, she said, what are we protecting today? I pulled out the folder, the deed, the letter, the notarized paperwork George had left me. I placed them on the desk one at a time. Lorna didn't ask many questions. She read each page slowly, her glasses slipping down her nose, tapping the table with her finger now and then. When she finished, she looked at me and said, he was smart. I nodded. She sat back in her chair, arms crossed. You want to keep it safe? Yes, I said. Just safe. From everyone, including Patrick. She didn't flinch. Good. Because once we do this, it'll be airtight. You'll stay the only one who has any say unless 2 doctors declare you unable to make decisions. I took a breath. That's exactly what I want. She slid the documents into a new folder, then pulled out a blank form from her drawer. We'll create a living trust. Name you the sole trustee. Add a few protection clauses, peace of mind things. No one can transfer, develop, or apply for permits without it going through you. I watched her write in clean, block letters, just like George used to. She added a clause that would flag any attempt to register the property under a different name. Another clause that stopped Patrick or Elise from using my name in any filings. Lorna looked up. We'll even assign a local attorney in Waynesville to get alerts if anyone tries anything fishy at the county level. I nodded. Quiet protection. I like that. It's not about hiding, she said. It's about staying standing. There was no big moment. No gavel. Just me sitting across from a woman who knew how the world worked and was willing to make sure I didn't get boxed out of my own life. After we finished the paperwork, she handed me a copy of everything in a plain envelope. Put this somewhere you can get to easily, she said, and don't tell anyone what's in it unless you need to. I nodded again. As I stood to leave, she asked, You okay? I paused. Better than I've been in a long time. She smiled. Good. That house isn't just real estate, Sophia. It's story. And you're the only one who remembers the whole thing. On the way home, I didn't turn the radio on. I cracked the window instead and let the wind move through the car. I thought about how long I'd spent trying to be agreeable, keeping things peaceful, saying yes when I wasn't sure, smiling through confusion. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't even about Patrick and Elise. This was me finally putting a line in the sand, quietly, firmly, without raising my voice. At home, I placed the envelope on the top shelf of my closet. Not hidden, not displayed, just where I could reach it. Later that evening, I made tea and sat by the window. The sky had gone soft again, pink along the edge where the sun dipped behind the mountains. No one called. No one needed anything. For once, that felt good. I wasn't waiting to be asked. I wasn't trying to be invited in. For the first time in years, I had chosen something just for myself. And I wasn't sorry for it. They picked the place. It was one of those restaurants that tried too hard to look rustic. Brick walls, Edison bulbs, polished wood floors. Everything designed to look like it had history, even though it was barely 5 years old. The host greeted them like regulars, called Elise by name, asked if they wanted their usual table. I followed behind them in silence. We were seated near a window, a long table, white linen, polished silver. Elise took the seat across from me, Patrick to my left. Menus were already waiting, closed. The waiter poured water, and Elise smiled. We're so glad you could make it. Patrick nodded. Really glad, Mom. I smiled faintly and picked up my napkin. There was no small talk this time. No stories about travel or recipes or family. Just business. Elise opened a leather-bound folder. We wanted to walk you through our vision. The first page had a logo, Willow Edge Events. Below it, in smaller letters, a legacy experience. She flipped to the next page. A rendering of the Waynesville house, but not as I remembered it. The porch had been extended. The orchard turned into parking. The barn had lights strung from corner to corner. Then came financials, target markets, booking projections, photos of similar properties already operating in other states. Elise did most of the talking. Her voice was steady, practiced. She called the house a strategic asset. She used words like elevate and optimize. Patrick chimed in now, and then, mostly to nod or add a quick detail. We'd start with soft openings, test the market, then scale from there. I listened. I kept my hands in my lap. I didn't touch the folder. Finally, Elise reached the last page. A short summary. Below it, a signature line. My name was already printed beneath it. She slid the folder gently toward me. "All that's left," she said, "is your blessing." I looked down at the papers for a long time, not reading, just looking. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out a plain manila envelope. I placed it on the table. Patrick looked confused. Elise kept her smile. Inside was a copy of the trust, the clauses, the restrictions, the notarized statements. Every page Lorna and I had carefully gone through. Patrick opened it and began reading, slowly, page by page. I didn't speak. I didn't explain. Elise leaned in to look over his shoulder. By the third page, her expression changed. The crease between her eyebrows appeared. Her mouth tightened. Patrick reached the last page, the one that spelled it out clearly. Nothing could be done to the property without 2 doctors declaring me mentally unfit. He closed the folder. His hands stayed on the table. Folded, he let out a slow breath through his nose. "So you've made up your mind." I nodded once. I just wanted it recorded. No shouting, no anger, just facts. Elise reached for her water, but didn't drink. Her eyes didn't meet mine. Patrick stared at the table. "You could have told us sooner." "I could have," I said, "but you seemed prepared either way." No one touched their food when it arrived. We sat in silence for a minute or two. Then I folded my napkin, placed it on the table, and stood. "I'll drive myself home," I said. Neither of them tried to stop me. Outside, the evening air was sharp. A little breeze, the kind that smells like dry leaves and cold brick. I walked to my car slowly, not because I was tired, but because there was no need to rush. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. Inside, I felt steady, not proud, not triumphant, just still. At home, I changed into my night clothes, made a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table. I looked around my small home, quiet, simple, mine. The manila envelope was back on the top shelf of the closet. I didn't need to open it again. What needed saying had already been said, not with words, but with action, with lines drawn not in anger, but in clarity. That night, I slept with the window open. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't lie awake wondering what Patrick thought of me. I wasn't afraid of what he'd do next, because now, whatever happened, I had something stronger than permission. I had certainty. That was the moment she chose herself, and didn't apologize for it. If you've ever had to draw a line to protect your peace, even from someone you love, click the like button and tell us what gave you the strength to finally say no. The gravel crunched under the tires as I pulled up to the old estate. It had been years since I'd driven that road. The trees hung low, and vines curled over the gateposts. The grass was taller than it should have been, and the mailbox leaned to one side. But when I stepped out of the car, I felt something steady underneath it all. The house still stood strong. I walked up the front steps and slipped the key into the lock. It turned without resistance. The door opened with that same old sound, with dragging slightly across the threshold, like the house was clearing its throat. Inside, the air was still, a little musty, but familiar. Dust floated where the sunlight peeked through the curtains. I set my bags down in the front hallway and stood there for a moment. No one called. No one waited for me. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't mind. The next morning, I opened every window, let the breeze in, took out a broom, and started sweeping. I wasn't in a rush. I cleaned room by room, just enough to breathe again. The rose bushes out front had grown wild. thorns tangled with the railings. I trimmed them back, careful not to cut too deep. George used to say they bloomed better when you didn't baby them. In the evenings, I cooked whatever I had on hand, simple meals, beans, eggs, sometimes soup. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. One afternoon, I pulled out an old spiral notebook I'd found in the pantry. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a page, then another. I didn't plan what to say. I just let my hands move. Some days I wrote about the house, some days about George, and some days I just listed what I had done that morning, swept the porch, watered the vines, washed the old china that still sat in the corner cabinet. Time passed slowly, but not in a painful way. About a week in, I heard a knock on the back screen door. It startled me. I hadn't had a visitor yet. A woman stood there, holding a cloth bag and a jar of honey. "Hope I'm not intruding," she said. "I live down the hill. I saw the lights on this week. Thought I'd stop by." Her name was Ruth. She was retired, used to be a gardener at the local botanical center. Said she recognized the rose variety out front. We sat on the porch that afternoon, drinking tea. She brought ginger cookies. I made lemon balm from herbs in the backyard that somehow still grew. We didn't talk about anything heavy at first, just gardens, weather, old recipes. A few days later, she came by again, this time with clippings from her greenhouse. She asked if I'd ever taught anyone how to dry herbs. I told her I hadn't, not formally, but she asked if I'd be willing to show her anyway. So I did. We laid out sage and lavender on cheesecloth in the sunroom. I explained how to tie the stems, how to store them in paper bags until they crisped. Ruth took notes like it was a class. The next week, she brought 2 other women with her. One had arthritis in her hands and carried a notebook anyway. The other brought a peach cobbler. They sat around the table while I showed them how to make rosemary oil. It wasn't a workshop, not really. Just a few women sitting together, learning something small, saying things out loud they hadn't said in a while. One woman shared that her daughter had stopped calling after moving to Florida. Another admitted she didn't know how to cook for one person after her husband passed. No one tried to fix anything. We just listened. It became a rhythm. Every Saturday around noon, a few women came by. Some weeks it was just 2 of us. Some weeks 5 or 6. We drank tea, dried herbs, swapped recipes, swapped stories. Nobody wore makeup. Nobody apologized for crying. Nobody talked about being strong. We didn't have to. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was proving anything. I wasn't being a good mother, or a good wife, or a good example. I was just being, and that felt like something worth holding on to. At night, I'd sit on the porch with a blanket and listen to the quiet, the wind in the trees, the creak of the boards beneath my chair. I thought about Patrick sometimes, but not in the same way. I didn't wonder what he was planning or if he was angry. I just hoped he was learning what it meant to pause, to notice, to sit still long enough to remember what matters. The house didn't ask anything of me. It let me move at my own pace, let me settle back into my skin without asking for explanations. I realized I hadn't been waiting to be remembered. I'd been waiting to remember myself. And in that old house, with dust in the corners and tea on the stove, I had finally started to. I was in the shed rinsing old jars when I heard tires on gravel. It wasn't delivery or Ruth's pickup. The sound was sharper, newer. A car that didn't belong out here. I dried my hands and stepped out into the yard. Patrick was standing near the oak tree at the edge of the clearing, hands in his pockets, wearing a gray jacket that looked like it had never seen dirt. He didn't wave. I didn't either. We stood there for a few seconds, just taking each other in. Then he walked closer, stopped a few feet from the porch. I didn't know if you were still out here. I am, I said. You're a long way from downtown. He looked around slowly. It's quieter than I remembered. It always was, I said. He glanced at the house, the open windows, the clean porch. You've done a lot with it. I'm not doing much, just keeping it steady. He nodded, then shifted his feet. Elise is staying with her sister for now. We hit a wall with the planning. County denied the zoning variance. Investors are pulling back. He looked tired, not just in his face. His whole posture sagged. I waited. Then he said, "You blindsided me, Mom." I stayed still. He shook his head, slightly. "You never used to keep things from me." I didn't argue. Patrick stepped up onto the porch. He didn't sit. He just stood there like he wasn't sure if he belonged. "You always told me family sticks together, that we take care of each other. Now, I feel like you've given up on me." His voice wasn't angry. It was smaller than that. I folded my arms. "I haven't given up on you, Patrick, but I've finally stopped giving up on myself." He looked at me like I'd just spoken in another language. I took a breath. You talk about legacy like it's something to be built with floor plans and logos. But this house already has a legacy. You just stopped paying attention to it. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "You're not the only one who's had to adjust," I said. "I had to learn how to be alone again after your father died. I had to figure out who I was without him. And without you calling." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't mean to disappear." "I know," I said. "You were building your life. I wanted that for you." He stared at the rose bushes. "It feels like you don't trust me." "I trust you to be who you are," I said, "but I also know you don't see this place the way I do. And that's okay. But I won't hand it over just because it fits someone else's dream." He sat on the steps, finally, leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "It's hard," he said, "trying to make things work, figuring out what counts. I thought you'd be proud of us for thinking big." I softened. "I am proud of your ambition, but big isn't always better. And love doesn't mean handing over history like a coupon. It means setting limits when they're needed. It means saying no when yes would cost too much." He stayed quiet. I sat next to him. "You think I've had it easy, but you never saw the struggle because I didn't let you. I shielded you from the tight months, the bills, the decisions that kept the lights on. Not because I wanted to spoil you, but because I wanted you to grow up believing the world had space for you." He looked over at me. "So that was a mistake." "No," I said, "but I should have taught you that love has edges, that sacrifice isn't endless, and that not everything is meant to be leveraged." The wind picked up a little. The trees rustled. "You've always looked ahead," I said. "I admire that. But sometimes you have to look around, too. See what's here, not what it could sell for." He nodded slowly. "I didn't come to fight. I just didn't know where else to go." I reached over and placed my hand on his. "I know." We sat there a little longer, watching the sky shift into evening. Patrick stood first. "I'll head out. I've got some things to think through." I stood too. "You'll figure it out." He looked back at the house one last time. "It's more peaceful than I expected." "It always was," I said again. He walked to his car, opened the door, then paused. "Do you need anything before winter?" I smiled just a little. "I'm fine." He nodded. "Okay." Then he got in, started the engine, and drove away. I didn't watch him leave. I turned back toward the house, stepped inside, and closed the door. No triumph, no relief, just a stillness I had learned to respect. For once, I didn't carry his disappointment. I left it right there on the porch where it belonged. The morning came in quiet. The light moved across the floor in slow lines, brushing the edge of the rug and catching on the corner of the old cupboard. I stood at the sink with my hands around a warm mug, just listening. No traffic, no notifications, no footsteps overhead, just the kettle on the stove cooling down. It had been weeks since Patrick visited. He hadn't called. I hadn't called him either. And somehow that silence didn't feel empty. It felt full of space I hadn't let myself have before. I took another sip and looked toward the closet. The manila folder still sat on the top shelf. But today, I didn't reach for that. Instead, I walked to the cedar chest, the one I'd opened after finding George's letter. I pulled it out gently and sat on the floor beside it with a pen and paper in hand. Not for George, not for Patrick. For me, I started with my name, Sophia Brooks. I sat with that for a while. Then I wrote, "You did your best." That was the first truth I needed to say. When George died, I tried to fill every space. I cooked more. I cleaned too much. I stayed busy until I wasn't sure what silence even sounded like. I kept giving to Patrick, to the house, to people who never really asked, because giving made me feel useful. And I thought being useful meant being loved. But needing and being needed aren't the same as being seen. I wrote that next. I thought back to the woman I used to be, the one who packed Patrick's school lunches while quietly skipping her own breakfast, the one who paid bills in silence, stretched meals with rice, and made birthdays feel full even when the cupboards weren't. That woman thought saying yes was a virtue. She thought holding back her feelings kept peace in the house. She thought love meant making yourself small. I sat with that for a while, let it settle. Then I wrote something I never had the courage to write before. You deserve to be included. At the wedding, at the table, in the photo slideshow, in conversations about the past. You raised a child. You carried a marriage. You built a life. You deserved a seat at the front. I folded the page gently and tucked it beside George's letter. Not to bury it, but to keep it safe. Outside, the dogwood tree had started blooming again. Pink petals opened slowly, like the house was exhaling. No one called that morning. No one knocked on the door. But the home was full. The sun poured through the blinds, warm and easy. I made cinnamon tea and opened the windows to let the breeze in. The air smelled like soil and wood and something soft I couldn't quite name. I didn't turn on the news. I didn't check the time. I just stood there barefoot on the porch, feeling the wood beneath me, the wind tugging gently at my sweater. And I knew something simple and quiet. I was finally enough. Not because anyone said so, not because of a thank you or an apology or a title, but because I stopped asking for proof. The past didn't disappear. It softened. And the story I thought was about loss had turned out to be about return, not to what I used to be, but to something truer. I sat down in the old chair by the window and watched the leaves flicker in the light. They danced like they knew I had come home, not to a place, to myself. Have you ever given too much hoping it would earn you love? What would it feel like to give back to yourself instead? If this story reminded you of your worth, share it. There's someone out there who needs to hear your voice, too. And if it brought you comfort or made you feel seen, I hope you'll like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who might need it today. Because we all deserve to take up space, and no one should have to ask for permission to be whole.